Hi there guys, and welcome to today's episode of the Back in Shape podcast. Today we're going to be covering everything when it comes to the hamstrings and lower back pain. One of the most common muscles to be associated with lower back injuries, be that a bulging disc, sciatica, be it some sort of degenerative disc disease or spondylolisthesis, no matter what the condition is, we nearly always have some degree of issue with the hamstrings. And that's why so frequently we get asked in the membership about tight hamstrings, what should I do to stretch them, etc. Well, hopefully in today's episode, you're going to understand a little bit more about this intricate relationship between both the hamstrings and the lower back, and understand how these two play into one another, and also understand the tightness that is inevitably, in most cases, present in the hamstrings and how this plays into the lower back, and also how the hamstrings are going to be helpful for you long term in terms of building back resilience as well. So quite a lot to cover here. I've got a lot of notes on the board, so hopefully it's going to be a really, really helpful one for you guys. As always, if there's any questions, any comments, use the comment section underneath to post those there. We read and reply to all of those, and they help us guide the podcast going forwards for future episodes as well. So let's start off by covering the anatomy of the hamstrings, how they affect the hips, how they affect the knees, and much more than that as well. So first and foremost, the hamstrings consist of three muscles. We've got the bicep femoris, which is a bit of a peculiar one. That one runs from the sitting bone, well, they all run from the sitting bone, down to the outside of our lower leg. And that's going to be really the fibula, a little bit on the tibia as well, but it runs on the outside. It also attaches part way up to the actual femur, the thigh bone as well, unlike the other two. The other two, the semimembranosus and tendinosus, those both run more down the inside of your thigh, on the back still, not adductors, but down the back on the inside of the thigh. And what this gives us is, and they run down to the tibia from the same origin or starting point, the ischial tuberosity or the sitting bones. What this gives us is, with our biceps on the one side and the group of semis on the other side, they can also, when the knee is bent or flexed, they can provide a little bit of rotation, a little bit of guidance to the lower leg, causing the foot to go inside or outside, as the case may be. So they give a lot of control and a lot of power as well to that lower leg. And they work, obviously, as many of you will know, to bend the knee, so that's flexing the knee, but they also work to extend the hip. That is going to be some of the driving force behind us moving around the world. That's walking, that's getting up out of a chair, etc., and working very closely with the function of the glutes. Now, they're one of those muscles that does attack or does act over two specific joints. So it is going to have effects on the hip and on the knee as well. And therefore, in certain positions with certain movements, we're going to find that they are going to allow more mobility, for example, like a squat, or in others, like a hip hinge, which we'll get onto later, both of these movements, they're going to perhaps limit the range of motion in a little bit more of a pronounced way. The final thing that's really important about these is how they pertain to the lower back, or how they affect the lower back. Now, when the hamstrings tighten up in a test tube environment with no other muscles, etc., what they're going to do is they're going to take the pelvis and they're going to pull you into that posterior rotation, that posterior pelvic tuck, because as they attach on the ischial tuberosities, those are slightly to the back of the axis of rotation of our pelvis. That's kind of like, if you imagine your pelvis is like a steering wheel, if you will. We've got the spine on top, we've got the hip socket roughly in the middle, but not quite. It's off-centered a little bit. Then we've got sort of the pubic bone on the front, and then we've got the ischial tuberosity just off to the back, but on the sort of the lower portion of that steering wheel. As the hamstrings pull down on here, they're going to get a bit of posterior rotation through the pelvis. Now, we'll see later on how the muscles in other areas of the body, the core, the trunk region, if you will, those are going to provide a brace to restrict this motion and work against this motion to transmit the power from those hamstrings up into the upper body to do certain movements. But that's fundamentally how they work. And many of you who have done activities like yoga and Pilates, or even other physiotherapy exercises, will have become familiar with or experienced the pelvic tuck. So that's something that we talk about. And we talk about that a lot in other episodes of the podcast. And one of the important things is when you do that posterior pelvic tuck, what you're doing is you're flattening out and eliminating the lordosis of the lumbar spine. That's the natural curvature, the curvature that's very important. And that is most pronounced at the L5-S1 and L4-5 regions. Coincidentally, particularly the L5-S1, but also the segments above and slightly below. The nerves that come out of those regions of the spine go down to control the hamstrings. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later on. But that's kind of an overview of how those hamstrings work. Now we get on to the tightness around the hamstrings. And fundamentally, this is very, very simple. Modern life, as we've touched on in many podcasts after reading some of these stats, the average adult spends about 9.5 hours. This is the average working age adult, spends about 9.5 hours every day sitting. We are very, very sedentary. And as a result of that, the hamstrings often are in a position of shortened position rather than an elongated position. We could take the lower back as an example, being the opposite being true. In the lower back muscles, we're often sat slouched because of that posterior pelvic tuck. Maybe there's some relevance to the hamstrings there, but we're often sat with our bum tucked under and stretching out all the muscles on the lower back. And this is a great example, as we've discussed on previous episodes, where tightness in both the hamstrings and tightness in the lower back muscles are two different things that are happening. On the one case, for the lower back, as we flatten our lordosis and we sit for long periods, those muscles are pulled apart, yet they feel tight. Whereas the hamstrings also feel tight, yet they're shortened because our knees are maybe tucked underneath our chair or something like that. But essentially, the hamstrings are in a shortened position. They're also not used a lot. And if the hamstrings are not going to be used a lot from a point of view of activity, because we spend so much time every day, our body is very, very intelligent and it adapts to what we do. And too many of us, unfortunately, do not partake in regular resistance-based training. We are not active enough. We're not building any strength. So we end up developing these muscles that are both tight and weak. And we can explore whether they're tight, as I've just discussed with regards to the relationship between the lower back muscles and the hamstrings another time. But for today's episode, let's just understand that these muscles are tight and they are weak. And by definition, they don't exist in a test tube. They exist with all the other muscles. And in many cases, those other muscles are also going to be weaker than they otherwise should be. And it's this weakness that is really important going forwards. Because generally speaking, although there are some exceptions to this, the stronger the muscles are, the more they're going to be able to accommodate and deal with the stresses and strains of daily life. They're not going to tense up. A great example of this is as you get stronger, you will inevitably find with correct form that the movements such as squats, etc., become more controlled. They become more comfortable, but they become more mechanical in nature, smooth rather than jittery and wobbly, because the muscles aren't used to being able to be used in that way. And as we improve that strength, we generally are able to have a little bit more balance to our body. That's something that we'll touch on a little bit later on. So we've covered sort of the common causes, understanding that there's tightness there in the hamstrings, but also there is inevitably going to be weakness, and understand that if we don't use our body, we develop a degree of weakness that comes in tandem with that tightness there. And muscles will know if they're not going to be used, I may as well tighten up, because if I tighten up, I can't move too much, because it's movement that I can't control that's really going to create trouble. So now if we understand a little bit more before we get into the next parts in terms of the relationship between lower back pain specifically, let's just take a moment to understand how healthy and strong hamstrings are going to really be good for our health and well-being and the health of our lower back period. So fundamentally, when the hamstrings are working properly, we have a strong organism. You are a strong person. Not only the hamstring strong because you're active, other muscle groups are strong and you have good control over them. And one of the core movements of the hamstrings is going to be that drawbridge, that hip hinge movement that occurs at the hip. And we talk about this as one of the specific exercises, very similar to a stiff leg deadlift, is that we have a dynamic strength to the hamstrings. When that pulls on our pelvis, the muscles of our trunk and core and back muscles generally all work to provide a static strength. And that means they hold the spine still. And as the hamstrings pull on that pelvis, instead of a posterior pelvic tuck happening, the whole pelvis with the core and the trunk, like the stiff part of a drawbridge, gets raised. So as you get out of that chair, your core and back muscles maintain stiff rigidity to the trunk, so that your hamstrings can use the hip socket as an axis of rotation, a point of rotation, and raise your body to the upright position. That's how they work fundamentally when integrated into a strong system. And we are focusing a bit more on the top end because that's relevant to you with back pain, but there's additional comments that we could make with regards to their blending and functioning with other muscles lower down in the body as well, but we won't get into that for today. But fundamentally, those hamstrings allow for good movement when they are flexible as well, to focus going through the hip, which is a very strong joint in all ranges, so that movement doesn't leak into the lower back. For example, as we're going through that bending motion, if we have good flexibility in the hamstrings, that's going to allow our lower back, as we're perhaps brushing our teeth in the morning or washing our face in the morning, that's going to allow our lower back to lower with a straight spine. Because our hamstrings are nice and flexible, it will be able to lower all the way as is necessary for the movement. It's very rare that we have to go all the way down to the floor, although there are some activities in daily living that might necessitate that. They are rare, and they're often activities which don't involve a lot of lifting or a lot of load. But for the typical drawbridge action like washing your face or brushing your teeth, the healthy, good range of motion hamstrings are going to allow that movement. Then if we contrast that, which we'll get into in a moment, a little bit more with if those hamstrings weren't flexible and weren't strong, what would happen is you'd lower the drawbridge, and then we get to a point where we're stuck, and now the movement translates into the lower back. Obviously my arm doesn't bend, but the movement translates into the lower back, and now we shift our weight onto the discs. We squash down on the front portion of the discs, particularly at L4-5, L5-S1 segments of the lumbar spine, and that's where those weaknesses can become exposed. That's in a healthy spine. That may not be a problem. But if you're someone that's injured your lower back, now all of a sudden that reduced range of motion can be an issue. So how does the lower back tightness, the hamstring tightness, impact us if we have lower back pain? Well, the vast majority of members over the years, of patients that we've seen clinically over the years as well, and we're talking about a significant number here, they're not power lifters, they're not Olympic lifters, and they're not bodybuilders. Although there have been a couple in that scenario, most of them are ordinary people just like you watching this, and most of them do not have sort of higher than normal levels of strength. Most of them, unfortunately, spend too much time sat down every day, do not partake in regular resistance-based activities, and are not strong enough or strong as they should be. And in this individual, the competence of those other muscles is also in question. The strength of those other muscles is also substandard. And therefore, that strong drawbridge, which we've just discussed, is not taking place in that individual. They have an injury at L5-S1 or L4-5, be it a herniated disc, a bulging disc, maybe it's a chronic issue, maybe there's some degenerative disc disease, maybe there's some spinal arthritis there, maybe in the more severe cases, there's a spondylolisthesis where we've got some real instability at the lower levels of that lumbar spine. Now, all of a sudden, the hamstring tightness is going to be pulling on the lower back, preventing that drawbridge from occurring, but also pulling on that lower back. So movement is leaking into the lumbar spine when the hips could or should be able to take that full range of motion. The result of that is that the hamstrings too readily result in a pelvic tucking motion taking place into the lower back, which leads to problems. And when we have a lower back injury, we have additional complications at play. Number one, yes, we have the tightness there. The hamstrings are not as flexible as they should be, which means our joint range of motion at the level of the hip is not as flexible as it should be. The hips don't move as freely as they should do. So therefore, like we've just discussed, movement from the hip that should be in the hip leaks into the lower back. We also find that we get pain. We have regular pain attached. What happens when you move in a certain way around the house and your back flares up? You get a shooting pain, perhaps. Maybe it's just a significant spike in the level of pain. You go into spasm. Your muscles wince. You wince, even if it's not muscle spasm in the way we think of, perhaps, to state that. If you, for example, touch a thorny bush, for example, you're going to go into spasm. Your muscles are going to contract and pull away. Well, this is one of the big issues that people have when it comes to stretching, because when they have low back pain, they just do tight hamstring stretching, tight hamstring stretching, tight hamstring stretching. It has no cumulative effect. And every single time you have a pain flare-up, the muscles tighten up again from the moment-to-moment spasm. Then we have the secondary issue that layers on top of this and makes it worse, and that is the very fact that the nerves that come from the segment of the spine that's injured, because most commonly in lower back pain, the origin is going to be the L5-S1 segment with various factors or specific injuries, which we don't need to get into here. We get into those in other podcasts, or the L4-5 segment. Those segments, and more so the L5-S1 than the L4-5, but they're going to be sending signals down to the hamstrings. Now, some of the signals that we might get with a lower back injury might be that you get numbness, you might get pain, you might get sciatic type symptoms going down the leg. And whenever you flare up your lower back or move in a jolty or funny or peculiar way, you get that flare up and that shoots pain down those areas. Some people experience numbness, some people experience burning. One of the other signals that's transmitted, and technically those sensations are actually, and this is going into maybe too much detail, but those signals of sensation are actually sent up to the brain rather than down to the leg, but that's just a matter of perception. We don't need to get into that here. But the signal that does go down from the spine is going to be the motor control, and that is sending signals down to that hamstring to tighten up. So we have, not only do we have the moment that we aggravate our lower back, we get a reactive or reflexive muscle spasm occurring in the hamstrings and probably many of the other muscles in that region as you wince in pain. We also have this neurological loop sending signals, because it's an injured segment, sending signals. Maybe there's a bit of disc bulging into that nerve root, and it's sending signals down to his hamstrings to tighten up. So you're just in this silly little loop. You do a bunch of stretching, You free off a bit of motion, but because you freed off the motion, you haven't done any stretching. You're not able to competently deal with that extra range of motion. That's something for another time. This is why people who have hypermobility, for example, really struggle, because there's not the strength there and there's a lot of wobbliness. So you free off that range of motion, but then you move funny because someone passes you the kettle, or the kids quickly run into the other room and you move or jolt in some way, shape or form. That aggravates the lower back. So, you wince in pain. And then because you've aggravated the back, we get renewed or refreshed signals going back down to those hamstrings to tell them to tighten up. You can see how this is just a loop of in perpetuity of just doing hamstring stretching and then end up aggravating our back again, and then we go back to square one each and every time, and it's just not helpful. Not to mention the fact that so many people, when they are doing hamstring stretching, just fold over. The classic, bend down and touch your toes. You fold over. 95% of the initial movement is coming from your lower back, not from the hips, and therefore is not actually stretching the hamstrings until you get to the very end part of range of motion, and then it starts to pull the hamstrings. Well, in the process of doing that, it's no different to the knee hugs, the pelvic tucks, the child's poses that we've discussed in many other podcasts, and they are not helping the underlying injury. So the form with which we do our hamstring stretching is inappropriate. And ultimately, this is why things just go round and round in circles and we don't get any real results. And that's the biggest problem with the complexities around hamstring tightness and lower back injuries. We have to take a step back and go, right, the hamstrings are weak and they're tight. That's a problem. But our lower back is injured, and that's going to be perpetuating the problem. We want to take on board strategies that are going to help improve the status quo in our back so that it's less vulnerable and so that it is able to get some momentum with the healing process, so that my flexibility work can actually be helpful. And what's the way we do that? With strengthening. Now, we've gone a reasonable way through this podcast. A reasonable number of minutes I've been talking now, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that we're against hamstring stretching, and this is not the case. But you must learn to stretch the hamstrings correctly, and that is through a hip hinge movement. Many of you who struggle to do the hamstring stretches and fall into this trap won't be able to do that movement, and it's not a surprise, because if you've got back pain, you probably couldn't do the movement before you injured your back anyway, and that's partially a reason for having the problem. But you must learn to do the stretch appropriately in a way that doesn't damage the lower back, and that is through appropriate hip hinging movements, which can take some time to learn. But we have to live in the real world, and we understand that hamstring stretching is a very, very small part in the early days, and a part of with limited reward for time invested. Sure, it may help the movement a little bit, but as we talk about with members in the program, it's a very, very small part of the rehabilitation they're doing. Instead, we need to work on strengthening. Strengthening is in a sensible manner. It is doing movements like the bridges or marching bridges, like hip hinges, like squats, like split squats or lunges. Those movements, they might sound scary, and we've discussed this on other podcasts as well, but at the end of the day, you're already doing these movements. They're real life movements that help you move the hamstring and strengthen the hamstring and work the hip joint properly, integrated with the other muscles, so it works in real life, not in a test tube. And that's why we're not particularly fond of machine-based exercises now. If you've got a specific hamstring tear, maybe it's been diagnosed on ultrasound or something like that, we're talking more about sports injuries here. And that is a bit of a different pathway. There may be the need to have some phase of your recovery adding in a bit of machine-based work, but that's not what we're talking about when it comes to back pain. That's a separate issue with separate considerations. When we're talking about lower back pain, we need to get on board doing those sorts of movements. Why? Because learning to do those movements correctly, even if you feel like you're pretty bad, number one, you're already doing those movements. You're already doing a squat because you get out of a chair. You might even be sat in a chair watching this video. You're already brushing your teeth in the morning and leaning over. You're already maybe doing some washing up, and you're most cases doing other activities of daily living. Very frequently we have members signing up saying, I can't get down onto the floor to play with the kids or the grandkids, or I'm struggling to get in the garden. That implies that you're doing those things anyway, and therefore don't be worried about doing exercises that are actually going to improve your health. But you have to take the appropriate care and caution to learn how to do those exercises correctly. But it is in doing those that, number one, you get an immediate benefit. You get an actual benefit from learning to move correctly. And that might be with a limited range of motion because your hamstrings are still tight. But that means that you're going to every day start to think about how you move, and therefore decrease from that day on, and more as the days progress, more effective as the days progress, you're going to decrease the likelihood of ordinary daily activities aggravating your back. You're not just going to jump on the floor with the kids and whatever happens. You're going to think about it a bit more and get down there in a sensible way. You might be thinking about it, but because you haven't got the education, you won't necessarily be thinking about the right things as you go down onto the floor. You might also be inadvertently doing things like rounding the back to try and ease some of the pain, which again, understanding that those things are impractical and maybe even detrimental to your recovery is really important. But as you start to work on strengthening, you start to allow yourself to be less vulnerable on a daily basis just by virtue of the way in which you're moving. But you also then get additional benefits. Number one, as you're moving better in those regards, you're also going to find that you're able to hip hinge a little bit better, and therefore your hamstring stretching will be a little bit more effective. Although in the early stages of recovery, it's still not really something we need to worry about or really pay that much attention to in any significant part. It's a very small part of recovery, and it's got a very small short-term effect, but it's still worth doing because it still takes a little bit of the strain off the lower back by moment to moment improving the range of motion of the hamstrings, but it is not progressive. The strengthening work is. Then as you get stronger and you start to progress and you do other things, you add maybe some resistance, you add on more complex movements, maybe going from just a simple squat to a hip hinge, and maybe from a simple squat and hip hinge to a lunge or a reverse lunge or something like that, to start to build in new skills that are making you ever more safe in the daily activities that you're doing. Healing starts to gather a bit of momentum. Now, all of a sudden, the tissues themselves are literally less vulnerable. More established healing has taken place. Now, maybe the signals that were going to that hamstring all day, every day, from the poor health and the poor healing that's taken place in that lower back, they start to abate a little bit. Now you'll find that your stretching, that little bit of stretching that you're doing correctly now, is actually going to start to have some positive effects. And once more, you're confident, you're competent, and you're able to explore the movements like the hip hinge, like the squat, etc., through deeper and deeper ranges of motion whilst maintaining better and better form. Now, all of a sudden, you're improving the tightness status quo of the hamstrings, and it's also having a massive knock-on positive effect on your lower back recovery too. And over time, by working on that strengthening first, you're going to find that you can start to feed in more robust flexibility protocols. Maybe it's utilizing long hold stretching. Maybe it's utilizing things like PNF stretching, etc. at the right time, which is later, to start to really improve the flexibility in the hamstrings where appropriate. We don't all have to do the splits. That's not an appropriate measure for day-to-day life of hamstring flexibility. Granted, it might well be helpful for you and your particular, personal desires to have a certain degree of flexibility. But improving to a baseline level where we can do good movements like the hip hinge, like the squat, with full ranges of motion, so we can get around in a daily basis. We can put our shoes on without having to hook our lower back like a prawn. That is what really improves our overall health and well-being. And it's done through strength, and then through strength with full range of motion. And by doing that process, you'll find that your hamstrings are less tight, your hamstrings are longer and more mobile, because muscles can still be long and tight at the same time, as we discussed at the start of the podcast. You'll find that your hip range of motion and mobility improves as well, which has no end of benefits to the lower back integrity, particularly if you have more significant and more objectively serious findings on x-rays or MRI imaging with regards to the causes of your lower back pain. And you find ultimately it leads to a healthier you and a more pain-free you. So hopefully today's episode of the podcast has been helpful. I know I've been popping up with that board to make sure I keep on track, but we had a lot of bits and pieces to cover. Hopefully it has really made you better understand this concept of hamstring tightness, and you can move forwards in a way that is more helpful. I know many of you that watch this are members of the program. You're doing the right sort of stuff, so you don't need to worry. You need to continue to move on. But those of you that are newer members, hopefully this has helped reinforce some of the why behind why we structure things the way we do. And those of you that are new, that aren't members of the program, hopefully this has been an insightful episode that's helped you better understand areas that maybe before you had certain ideas about, and maybe you're one of those people that's been stuck in that trap of constantly doing hamstring stretches and other sorts of stretches like child's pose, being told that it should be helping, but it's really not. And now you're 6 months or maybe even a couple of years down the line, you're still doing the same stretches, you're still struggling, and things really aren't improving. Understand this is why, because we're not approaching things in the right way. And if we start to flip things on our head, we'll find that we can make flexibility improvements and decrease the tightness in our hamstrings through strengthening. I know it sounds a little bit counterintuitive at a first glance, but hopefully this has really made that nice and clear. So as always, if you've got any questions, as I said at the outset of this podcast, post in the comments. We read and reply to all of those. If you're new, consider subscribing to the channel. We release these podcasts every single week. It's our way of helping you guys on YouTube, on Spotify, and the other platforms as well. Apple Podcasts, I think, as well. And as always, you can always get it and the full accompanying article on the website. Until next time, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Back in Shape podcast.